tu ets l'encarregat de que això no caigui mai, vale?
Agafaré algú.
Pobre, ara estaràs tota l'estona mirant aquí. Si ningú es mou gaire no li passarà gaire.
Vols deixar el vermell? No, el vermell? Sí, perquè així la hem de dibuixar directe.
Volia posar aquesta pregunta.
It's 7 o'clock. 6 o'clock in London. Cambridge. Welcome to Documenta's bookshop. We are proud to have you here. We are proud also to have Paul from the CIDOC. I think that it's a very difficult thing when we have the confirmation of a big writer to come to the bookshop to celebrate our 50th anniversary. Every time we had to search for someone who could speak with that person. And every time it's hard because we try to make things interesting for you also. Not only for the public that's here, but also for you. Finding Paul has been a gift for us, as also has been a gift that your publisher in Spain has made arrive to you our invitation. So thank you Critica, thank you Planeta Group, and thank you Mr. Beevor to be here today. Thank you Paul. Nosaltres celebrem avui una altra vegada i anem celebrant durant tot aquest any els 50 anys de Documenta. Aquesta llibreria que el Josep Cots i en Ramon Planes van obrir fa 50 anys i que és un espai on volem que sempre trobem els llibres que representen el nostre tarannà. Els llibres del senyor Beevor, the books of Mr. Antony Beevor, Sir Antony Beevor, have been here since I have memory. I don't have all the memory of the bookshop, but you have been here with us, making the life more interesting and the world more easy to understand. Thank you for that. I give you now the word to both. Thank you everyone to be here. Gràcies a tots per estar aquí. Gràcies a l'equip que ha fet això possible. No vull deixar la Nura, la Neus i tot l'equip de Documenta. Emma, a la traducció, Àlex, a la llenguatge de signes. Gràcies a tots. Per molts anys més Documenta. Thank you, Mr. Beevor. Come on.
Moltes gràcies, un plaer ser aquí. Benvinguts a tothom. És un honor, it's an honor to be able to share this conversation. I will speak English, but you have translation available. That will make the conversation ongoing as best as we can. Of course, I have in front of me, or next to me, perhaps the most important living historian in current times. So that is certainly a challenge for someone like me to introduce his work and interact with him, even more so because myself, I am not a historian. So that is a second challenge that I have in front of me. But I hope I'll do fine. I said the most important living historian, also because he's written extensively about World War I, World War II, the Spanish Civil War, the most decisive battles of the Second World War, including Stalingrad, of course, but also Normandy. So he has written on the most important events of the last century. And we are constantly reminded these days, despite the fact that we are all the time on breaking news mode. So that means that we are from crisis to crisis, and we cannot understand and digest the previous one, that the next one comes and looms onto us and creates a bigger problem. So the first question that I would like to address to Sir Beevor is why it is important to still look back at history and understand how the important events that we should have learned from, what can they tell us about today, and why is a historian as yourself an important figure to understand the world today?
Well, that great cynic, Otto von Bismarck, said, the only thing we learn from history is that nobody learns from history. And I'm afraid there is rather a lot of truth in that. As we will see when we start to look at what is happening now and the way that we should have seen it coming. But we have failed to recognize the lessons from history in the past. I think that the key is really to go back to that period just before the First World War, between 1910 and 1914, when Norman Angell, an English great political thinker, argued in his book, The Grand Illusion, that war was impossible in Europe because of the integration of communications and of commerce. Well, that's a mistake we start to see, should we say, rather more recently, when Angela Merkel, Gerhard Schröder think that actually war would be impossible with Russia because of the gas deals and all of the links created between Europe and Russia during the early 2000s. But the point is that German historians were absolutely right when they said that the First World War was the original catastrophe. And it was the original catastrophe, there's no doubt about it. But what is much more striking is the fact that it was actually the Russian Civil War, which, because of its horrors, its sheer sadism, cruelty, destruction, famine, everything, created this vicious circle of fear in the whole of Europe, certainly in Spain. I mean, when one thinks of Lago Caballero talking about the annihilation of the bourgeoisie, of Calvo Sotelo threatening, one sees the way that the mutual fear created during that particular period can actually then have an effect. I mean, I've had one or two friendly arguments with Spanish historians when they say that, words don't kill. Not true. I mean, when you think of what happened in October 1934, leading on then to the hatred created on both sides, the fear of the middle class when there was the rising in Asturias, and then of course the cruel suppression of the miners' revolt by Franco and the Regulares and so forth. It's hardly surprising. I mean, the rule of historians is that nothing is inevitable. Well, it's very hard to imagine how the Spanish Civil War could have been avoided after October 1934. But as I say, the point is, this vicious circle of fear between both sides and what it can create. We should be well aware of that now with social media, but we'll come back to that one, come back to that later. The point is, though, that this formed really, if you like, the pattern of the 20th century through to the Second World War. Now, the Second World War was not just a war between left and right, between sort of fascism, communism, or anything like that. And it certainly wasn't just a war between democracy and dictatorship. It was a combination of many things, as you know, and complicated with ethnic splits. I think there was always going to be some sort of conflict in Europe at that particular stage as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, the collapse of four empires during the First World War. But what changed it, of course, was Hitler himself, who gave it its completely, its sort of annihilatory character and its cruelty, which made it a war like no other in that particular way. So this particular war, when it started, again, the British and the French could not imagine it was going to happen, because they thought nobody could be stupid enough to want to have another war like the First World War, another war in Europe. But the problem is, though, that we always make the mistake. We have what can only describe as a democratic confirmation bias. And we cannot understand the mentality of dictators who have a burning resentment and anger. And that was certainly true of Hitler. It is, let's face it, also to a certain degree true of Vladimir Putin as well. And then again, something which we failed to see in the post-Cold War period, especially from sort of 2000 onwards, when Putin actually became president of Russia, that this burning resentment about the disintegration of the Russian Empire was going to manifest itself in a form of confrontation which was going to develop. Now, you know, one can argue, and historians will argue, what again was this inevitable that there was going to be conflict as a result of the expansion of NATO. Could it have been handled better? Yes, of course it could have been handled better. But at the same time, there was this burning, talking to people who knew Putin very much during his, shall we say, St. Petersburg period, when he was just the deputy mayor below Sobchak. There's no doubt about it, even then he had this fury about the idea that somehow both Belarus and Ukraine and other, Kazakhstan and so forth, that other parts, component parts of what had been the Soviet Union had been allowed to get some form of independence. But when we get then to, and obviously we'll be talking more about 1945 and the consequences and so forth in a moment, but I mean, when we get to this sort of Cold War period, or post-Cold War period, what's very striking is the way that in the period of, say, 1945, through to the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of 1989 and so forth, on the whole, the communist leaders of both China and Russia were reliable when they made a guarantee or there were discussions during that particular period. What I think is frightening now, and this is the whole issue surrounding any ending of the war in Ukraine, is that they have absolutely no compunction in breaking their word or in changing things. But again, something we will again come back to.
I'd like to go back to Ukraine and Putin in a minute, but
yes.
I'd like to take first this idea that you put forward now by saying we might have suffered previously from this democratic confirmation bias, and thought at that point that then, because the history was ending, we would never repeat the same mistakes. And now these days we are constantly reminded of possibly history repeating itself. Some people speak about a Third World War. Some people speak about a new Cold War between the US and China. How possible is that history repeats itself?
Well, I think in many ways the rule is history never repeats itself, but there are, shall we say, echoes and rhymes, as Mark Twain and others have mentioned in the past about what's happening. But we should certainly be able to learn from history. What we have also failed to learn, this is very striking, I think an important paradox, was that the moment of greatest hope, which was the collapse of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the opening up of Eastern Europe and all the rest of it, which was a moment of great hope and joy throughout most of Europe, was actually the moment when our problems of today started. Because 1989, 1990, all of that period saw the invention of the internet, and Tim Berners-Lee, who invented it, is appalled at what he felt he has created in many ways. We see the big bang of banking, we saw globalization, we saw deregulation in every way. And the effect of globalization, of course, was to enable, which enabled big companies, multinational companies, wherever it might be, to be able to source the cheapest materials wherever they wanted in the world, to be able to source the cheapest labor wherever they wanted in the world. And also the most brilliant, I mean, look at the way that Elon Musk has been bringing in all of the brightest Indians in technology to the United States. So you can actually manipulate, if you like, the world in a completely global fashion now, in a way that was not possible at the time. Now, the combination of these effects was obviously to create, again, a fear amongst people when we look at the way that they have no guarantee about the future, they do not know, they feel they have no control. Remember Brexit, you know, why did the British vote for Brexit? It was largely because this slogan saying, take back control, which was completely dishonest. But it was a very effective slogan for those people who felt that they had no further control. And what do we see in the United States? Isn't it fascinating? We see on Trump's inauguration day in Washington, we see all the richest men in the world, all lined up, the great tech titans standing there. And how did Trump come to power? Because he managed to get the losers to vote for the winners. Now, that takes quite some genius in its own particular way.
Sure. Following up on this, and you mentioned it before, which is, we can go a bit further into the US and the West and the UK in a minute, but let me bring you back to Russia.
Yeah.
You've studied it extensively, and you know very well that one of the reasonings behind Putin's narrative is the idea that most of the wars happening after the fall of the USSR, so I'm referring to Chechnya, I'm referring to Georgia, I'm referring to Ukraine these days, of course.
Yeah.
Most of these wars are a continuation of the great battles that Russia has been fighting for a long time, which is the liberation of its role in the world. So the feeling of needing to reassess its importance as a great power, as an important actor in
A
world
great
affairs.
colonial power, because they are colonial wars.
Sure.
I mean, Chechnya was the archetypal colonial war, one of the most brutal imaginable. And I remember, I mean, I was in Moscow when the apartment blocks were blown up, which was justification for the war. Well, I can tell you there were a lot of people who, needless to say, suspected who was it who was blowing up these apartment blocks, because it wasn't necessarily Chechens. So, I mean, you know, we see, if you like, a justification for wars at that particular stage, which is pretty terrifying.
Is resentment a driving force behind this?
Yes, I think so. I mean, again, it goes back to this idea, and one has to understand this question of what is Putin's ideology, because it's not just sort of, you know, his famous phrase saying that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. That implies that he is purely a, if you like, a Soviet man of the past. In many ways, of course, he is. I mean, he is still and has always been a career KGB officer, and that hasn't changed at all. The irony is he has always worked so closely with the GRU, which is the military intelligence, with all of their operations at Novichok and so forth. Should we say it was very striking the fact that in February 2000, during the presidential election, there he was, suddenly on the 14th of December 1999, Yeltsin announces that he's taking over as Prime Minister, that Putin is Prime Minister, and he's going to take over as President on the 1st of January. Then we start the presidential campaign, and Sobchak, who is Putin's greatest friend, his mentor, the mayor of St. Petersburg, is going off to help Putin in Kaliningrad, of all places, and he and his two bodyguards die within 5 minutes of each other, supposedly of heart attacks. I mean, you know, one's only got to go through the list of all of those who have died during this particular period. And there is little doubt about the sort of regime that we are talking about in a particular way. But I think that the ideology, which is the important thing to understand, is a curious mixture of the two, i.e. of the red and the white. Because actually Dugin and Medinsky, the former Minister of Culture, who was the one who really wrote most of that famous essay the year before the invasion of Ukraine, their belief is that, you know, Holy Slav Russia has the right to rule over the whole of the Eurasian landmass from Vladivostok to Dublin, because the West is corrupt, and only Holy Rus can sort of, you know, lead them in the future. So the idea that it is just Ukraine is completely wrong. He wants Moldova as well, we know, and any others. He tried to get Kazakhstan back, and this is one that's quite funny because this involves Medinsky. Putin decided to finance this incredible film. They spent a huge amount of money. This film called Panfilov and his 28 Men. And Panfilov was apparently, supposedly a commander during the battle for Moscow in 1941, in December 1941. And apparently he and 28 of his men, I mean, this makes the American Dirty Dozen, or, you know, one of those movies look even quite realistic in comparison. Apparently Panfilov and his 28 men managed to defeat a whole German panzer division. So this was turned into a tremendous heroism. And the trouble was that the head of the main state archives of GARS, the state archive of the Russian Federation, rather unwisely, I'm afraid, to his career, said, but we know this is absolute rubbish because the journalist of Krasnaya Zvezda, the Red Army newspaper, invented the whole story. But Medinsky then went public by simply saying, even if the story is not true, anybody who does the story is below swine. And, you know, it's a sort of mentality which is simply unbelievable. Of course, lots of people in Russia just thought that was very funny and ridiculous. It was almost like a sort of Trump exaggeration you don't take seriously at all. But it was quite revealing in the way that this was an attempt to persuade the Kazakhs basically to try to sort of come back into the fold of the Russian Federation.
Tell us a bit more about the war in Ukraine then, because it is a very classical war in a sense, right? I mean, it's a war about territory, by using trenches, by using military equipment that we thought it was not about the wars of the future, but rather about the wars of the past. There's a lot of technology involved, of course, in that war, but to what extent does the Ukraine war represent a return of the classical wars in European territory?
Well, it represents a return in the sense that we saw this sort of great invasion with tanks or whatever at the beginning But all wars are a certain mixture. I mean, you know, the Spanish Civil War, you know, started off almost a little bit like a Mexican Revolution in places, and then was sort of went through a stage really of the First World War, and then we have Stuka dive bombers and tanks and so forth. So it went through sort of like 3 years of war just within 3 years. I mean, we're seeing a fairly similar thing in Ukraine, and various paradoxes. Here we have Putin thinking at the beginning that it could be like 1945, and you know the tank armies would just roll straight into Kiev, and that would be the end of the war. But that didn't happen. They were ambushed and so forth. And then in the West, of course, all the European countries were saying, "Oh, well, that means it's the end of the tank." Well, actually, the Ukrainians were begging for tanks very, very soon afterwards. It wasn't quite the end of the tank. But you're quite right, we then get into that period, really from the November, I mean in October, November, basically November, where we have standstill in the east of Ukraine with the trench warfare, where the Russians immediately started creating their barriers. The danger here, and this was Zelensky's big mistake, Zelensky was so outraged by the atrocities which were being committed, by the destruction and all the rest of it, that he didn't want to give up an inch of land. And this is why we had the clash between Zelensky and the chief of staff. And even sort of, you know, American or European advisors were trying to persuade him, saying, listen, give flexibility, because your only chance of making use of the weapons we're going to be giving you is to pull back, get the Russians out of their trenches, and then hit them again or whatever. But there was obstinacy there, but this was sort of an emotional reaction, which I don't think that Zelensky could refuse or could fight. But what we do see, as you rightly say, is this extraordinary development of tech. Now, it wasn't the very first time, and the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh had already showed the way that drone warfare was about to change armoured warfare, and the way that the sort of Armenian tanks and so forth were destroyed so easily by drones in that particular stage. But I mean, the Ukrainians have developed it to an astonishing degree. It must be said that the Russians are catching up. I mean, last year they produced 1.4 million drones. Most of them are being built, as you probably know, in these underground car parks. Next year they intend, or rather this year, sorry, 2025, they intend to build 4 million drones altogether. Now these are both observation drones, obviously, but also so-called suicide drones and killer drones and all the rest of it. But it's also a terrifying foretaste of future warfare, because particularly the Chinese now, and then with AI, are looking at, if you like, completely self-guided, self-deciding weapon systems and weapons platforms, where if one takes the parallel, say, with the American stock exchanges, where if you can get a quarter of a second advantage over your rivals, you win. Now, in military terms, if you don't have to have any form of moral input or of, i.e., of human decision-making, and the drone or whichever it is, your automatic weapon system is able to take the decision itself, that immediately gives you an advantage. This is where democracies, of course, are going to once again be at a terrible disadvantage against the ruthlessness
and laws of war then.
and the laws. Indeed, this is something. We are seeing a terrifying change in the so-called rules of war.
Let me bring you now to Europe and your assessment of Europe's standing in what it represents, right? Because Europe, and when I say Europe, I also mean in particular the European Union,
Yes.
has been built against the idea of war, right? Or not to repeat the mistakes on European soil that were devastating the continent for so many years in the last century, right? It's the idea of cooperation will help us prevent another war. Integrating our sovereignties will help us prevent another war. Where is this idea now?
Well, it came, I'm afraid, if you like, it was...
I'm not asking as a British citizen, I'm asking as a historian.
I'm not embarrassed being a British citizen because I voted Remain, but unfortunately, it was, again, the great illusion. It was a grand illusion, the idea that, okay, during that particular period, you know, we, of course, nobody imagined that we would ever have war again because the Second World War had been so appalling. So it was the same mistake that the British and the French had made in the 1930s. And the idea that the European Union was there to basically to prevent war within Europe was actually out of date before it even started, I'm afraid. And it was a nice idea and all the rest of it, but it also has a fatal paradox. And that is that the more you integrate, the more you regulate, so as to create that unity, the more you're actually going to encourage the very nationalism which is going to undermine it later. And this, I'm afraid, is what we have been seeing in a big way in many parts of Europe, not just in Germany and all the rest of it, but in the different right-wing movements which have been developing. So I'm not trying to sort of say, I'm just trying to understand. It's not a question of making moral judgments at this particular point, to understand why we did what we did, or the way that it was going to, develop. But the real problem also was, shall we say, and this is the only thing that Trump has actually been really right about, of course, was that Europe basically did freeload off America by assuming that if there was ever going to be a threat from Russia during that Cold War period, oh well, the Americans will be there and all the rest of it. Even though there were protests in Germany against the positioning of cruise missiles or whatever it might have been. And it was always striking that, you know, Germany was, of course, the most pacifist, the most anti-militarist of all of the, sort of certainly of the Northern European nations. Others, shall we say, Finns, Scandinavians or whatever, had a much clearer idea that the threat still continued, that the Russian bear was not necessarily going to change its character. And that was especially became true towards the end, even when the great Soviet Union was starting to collapse. The anger and the bitterness was very much there. The idea of Andropov, the head of the KGB, and one of the very influential figure on Putin. The idea that sort of, you know, in Hungary in '56, you know, they had strung up and hanged the secret police, the police attached to the Hungarians, and the way that, of course, whenever one of the Eastern or Central European countries had revolted against Soviet domination, it had always been sort of, you know, the KGB who were the first target of those who were revolting. So, I mean, this tension was there, but there was also this bitterness, and I remember it well in the 1990s when researching in Moscow. Again, the anger, which in some ways one could understand the way that, for example, their economy had collapsed to the point that a pension for soldiers in the, you know, Red Army soldiers who had fought throughout the whole of the Second World War, who had saved Europe or whatever in the Soviet propaganda, you know, they got the equivalent of $20 a month maximum, and you know, there were their widows begging in the metro. And I remember when we were in the Ministry of Defense archives out at Morillas, you know, there were the old cleaners saying, isn't it wonderful that Raisa Gorbachev is dying of cancer? You know, they deserve it because he betrayed the Soviet Union. They could not see that, sort of, they felt that this was entirely had been a Western flop. So Putin had a lot of anger that he could exploit in this particular way, and resentment.
This idea of anger and resentment and taking from the past the lessons of today brings me to this idea of the age of the strong man, right? You've referred to Putin, but you've mentioned Trump on many occasions.
Yes.
Until now, Xi Jinping and other strong men, many others around the world, and some fear that this age of the strong man might see on the 8th of May a picture in the Red Square of Moscow of the three of them.
Mike the man.
Decisive, I said the night, sorry.
Yes,
deciding on the fate of these great powers ruled by strong men. I mean, is that a good picture, the picture of today's world?
Yes, because I mentioned earlier about the 1990s and the change in economic, in technological change, all of these things coming together. But what we're seeing today is far more terrifying. What we are seeing today is a moral, social change, the belief that might is right, that strength, the strong man has the right to do what he wants. We haven't seen this since Stalin and Hitler. I mean, the idea that we, the big men, the leaders, have the right to impose our decisions on whole populations, whether they want it or not. And we do see, as I say, this sort of terrifying idea now. Now, people talk about the big man theory of history, or great man theory of history, and all the rest of it. And that has been, by many historians, and sometimes with good justification, has been ridiculed ever since Carlyle and those in the 19th century, first talked of great man theory of history. But in fact, what we're seeing is a return of the great man theory of history in a big way. That the stupid, silly little decisions made by Donald Trump or whatever, can affect whole populations right across the world. We are seeing an irresponsibility and a change and an lack of predictability. Which is, as I say, simply terrifying. But this is the way that suddenly we have seen, literally in the matter of weeks or even months. It was, I'm sure, developing before, but we've suddenly seen it coming out now on how the world has changed. And this is a moral as well as a social change in this terrifying one.
Something we haven't mentioned, and perhaps I'd like to go to the end of the conversation and then move to questions from the audience. Something we haven't mentioned, I was saying, is that a lesson from Second World War and still today is the build-up of the UN system, the United Nations system, international institutions that will help us again promote cooperation instead of conflict, instead of rivalry among great powers, among great actors. And today what we are seeing is clearly the demise of this multilateral architecture, or the questioning of this multilateral architecture as a way to rule international relations. What's the state of this?
Well, the first thing that autocrats or dictators want to do, of course, is to destroy international institutions. We saw this with the League of Nations in the 1930s. And you see it even within the institutions of countries. They will target those institutions, they will undermine them, and then they will destroy them because they, in fact, maintain a form of order. And the one thing that the dictator, especially the upcoming dictator, wants is chaos so that they can exploit that. Now, with the United Nations, one has to remember this was the way that Stalin was prepared to make Roosevelt feel happy at Yalta, while Stalin took over control of Poland. That was Stalin. He didn't worry about the United Nations. He was far more interested. He had to have total control, because when one talks about the origins of the Cold War, they did not lie in 1947 and the Clay-Robertson Agreement or anything like that. The origins of the Cold War lay in 1941, when Stalin was so traumatized by the German invasion, that never again would he want to have a surprise attack like that. And that is why he was determined to control the whole of Central Europe, which of course led after the agreements at Yalta and the way that certainly the British and had obligations to Poland and all the rest of it. It was bound to be, therefore, it was bound to be a Cold War for those reasons. But the point is that having agreed to the United Nations organization, which he then played with, that's why Ukraine became a member of the United Nations, as well as Russia, as well as all of the other component republics of the Soviet Socialist republics. Stalin really was perfectly happy, to play the game in the United Nations, and to a certain degree the UN was able to do a number of things. I mean, I remember an old friend, General Mike Jackson, who was the one who was in Kosovo during the crisis then. And we nearly got to World War III when they arrived at Pristina and there were the Russian troops there. And General Wesley Clark was saying, move them from the airfield, we've got to fight. And that would have been the first time that since 1945 that there would have been fighting between NATO troops and Russian troops. Fortunately, Jackson was a Russian speaker, and he managed to sort of charm the Russians and refuse orders from above. In fact, he saved the day at that particular point. But I remember him saying that, when it comes to the United Nations, even when it came to the whole disaster of Srebrenica and the massacre which took place there, and the UN, I'm afraid, had been useless, particularly the local commissioner, whatever he was, who had not been prepared to back up the Dutch troops at Srebrenica. This was a real moment of shock. But as Mike says, if the UN didn't exist, we'd have to somehow invent it, because there is a situation often in the world where you've got to have some sort of mechanism, and at least the United Nations provided that. Now, we see when Putin starts suggesting that the UN should be running Ukraine, well, you know perfectly well that's because he knows that he can actually make sure that that disintegrates completely. And he has spotted the weakness there. So I'm afraid the UN, rather like NATO to a certain degree, is in a very, very vulnerable position at the moment. And I think we cannot really rely on any of the traditional international organizations. Some of them will carry on if sort of Trump is not able to, or Putin is not able really to interfere too far. So it's not a question of saying right across the board that is going to be sort of the end of the international order. But shall we say there will be some remnants which I think will stay in place, and we've just got to see what can be built on that or what can be preserved.
Okay, let me ask the audience if they have some questions that they would like to address to you.
Well, and to you too, I hope.
I'm only here to listen to you today, and I'm very happy to do so. Preguntes que puguin tenir. We'll take one by one.
Yes, one by one.
Primer aquí, i si en tenen més, ho senyalen i així els vaig veient.
Hi, Mr. Beevor. One question. Do you think that it's possible that the European Union, instead of NATO, could construct an independent army by themselves, or we will have to stay to pay the NATO that deeply is US, the interests of US in European soil? What do you think about it?
One of the big problems, it's an important question. I mean, one of the big problems is that because of underinvestment, and I'm not just talking in troops and weapons or whatever, what America has always provided in the past is been lift, i.e. the aircraft to be able and logistics and all the rest of it, which basically none of the European countries have invested in, thinking, oh, well, we can always rely on America. And this has been a big, big mistake. The other is intelligence. you know, the American intelligence system, the British are good in one or two areas, but overall, the American intelligence system, of course, is huge, and probably the most sophisticated. But you know, again, it's a question of spending. Nobody has actually really made that effort. I mean, Germany, it's terrifying that one got to a stage where Greece had far more Leopard tanks than the German army. You know, partly because they wanted to have them facing Turkey, of course. But I mean, you know, this is where things have got so bad that the armed forces had all been hollowed out. Now in Britain, I mean, we have got left enough ammunition to fight for 5 days because all of the ammunition has been given to Ukraine. But because of economic constrictions, nobody has signed any of the contracts with the factories to keep manufacturing the ammunition that is required. Is it surprising that Putin feels that he's in a completely winning position? I mean, I'm afraid this is how bad it is. Now, when it's a question of the organisation, say, of the European army, in a way, listen, there have been 1 or 2 experiments before, Franco-German brigades and things like that. I mean, the British even have done lots of different things and worked very closely with lots of different armies, and particularly with the German army. You know, and relations are all very, very good. There's no problem in that particular way. The thing is, though, that NATO did always have, if you like, the staff and the structure and the logistic organisation to make the whole thing work. But to create that now from the start for a European army as opposed to a NATO army is the work of several years. I mean, you know, it's not something which can be done overnight.
But
yeah.
I think it's not just about, as you said, investment, it's also about strategy, because probably the interest of Eastern Europe, the countries like Estonia, Letonia, are not the same like Italy, Spain, even Portugal.
You're quite right, absolutely. I mean, not even the same as, say, the southern part of, if you like, the Central European front. I mean, we see the Finns, who can put up to 300,000 soldiers into the field. The Swedes are ready to put in. At one point, they could be putting in 80,000 and then bringing that up to a total of 180,000. And also, of course, in the Baltic provinces. Now, Poland is in an interesting and difficult position because, as they've been saying, Poland has been building up its army in a very impressive way, and certainly been investing in a way which the rest of Europe should have been doing itself. But what do? They know perfectly well their support for Ukraine has, on the whole, tended to be logistic. But you know, would they be politically in a position whereby they could start taking troops from their frontier and front line and using them as part of the so-called coalition of the willing as a force in Ukraine for peacekeeping? There's a difference between peacekeeping and peace enforcement, and this is one of the problems which is going to be obviously arising in the days to come, on what will be the rules of engagement. Will they be fully armed? Will they be allowed to fight far back if they are attacked, and all the rest of it? Now the Poles, they obviously, I think, in a way, understand it. I think they feel that we have been invaded so many times by Russia in the past. We're going to fight for our own homeland. Of course, we'll help anybody we can, and they've certainly helped Ukraine wherever they've been able to help Ukraine. But one can understand them sort of feeling now this is a time where we've got to do it ourselves and look after ourselves. But then we've got Romania. Now, you know, what is going to happen in Romania, we don't know politically. With Hungary, of course, is pro-Putin at the moment under Orban. Whether that lasts, we don't know. But at the moment, we've got to assume that Hungary is very much, if you like, on the other side. So, you know, what what is a European army in those circumstances? This is a major difficulty. So I think in a way we are bound to stick with, say, for example, a NATO structure rather than say, well, one Brussels or one other Brussels, you know, NATO or EU. I think it's going to have to be NATO for the moment, even if it's going to be a NATO without the United States of America.
If I can add on this, because I think you're totally right in the number of challenges that these would pose, right? There's a challenge that comes with the idea that you were referring to, which is precisely strategic cultures in Europe are so different.
Yes.
And apart from so different historical perspectives and traditions, that would make it impossible to agree on a same set of objectives for that army, right?
Exactly. Absolutely.
And that is the biggest challenge, probably, because if you don't have that same reading on the strategic challenges that you face, it's very difficult that as a country you agree to share your sovereignty with others on the use of force, which at the end of the day is about bringing your own citizens to war, eventually, right? And it's who is able to decide on the fate of your citizens if they have to fight and perhaps die in a war, right? That is a very basic question about statehood, about sovereignty, about our societies, right? And I don't think we're really ready to make that step.
And actually, we've been here before. June 1940. Suddenly, you know, de Gaulle comes up with this idea that Britain and France should create a union to fight on against Germany. Well, you can imagine, Marshal Pétain and the others had absolutely refused to have anything to do with, for them, such an appalling idea. And you know what Pétain described? He said that would be marriage with a corpse. Now, one can see, you know, the idea here. I mean, you know, can one suddenly sort of unify by diktat countries, you know, so that they almost are forced to fight together or to fight on the same side against, say, a Russian attack. For the very reasons you just cited, I don't think that's possible.
Plus investment and the number of resources that you need to devote is certainly very difficult. We might come back to this, but there was a question at the end. Al final, allà?
Sí, hola. M'hauria preguntar...
Oh, right. What channel?
Number
2. Right. Yes.
Si m'hauria preguntar, quan parlem de Rússia sempre hi ha molta por, però no deixa ser un país de 140 milions d'habitants, 140 o 150. Contra la Unió Europea realment és una amenaça tan gran, tan existencial. Si podien sostenir un conflicte amb la Unió Europea durant, no sé, 5 anys, 6 anys, si porten amb Ucrània unes pèrdues militars terribles i tampoc han preparat el que s'esperaven. I després l'altra pregunta, vostè coneix molt la política russa, el Putin, ja té una edat, no durarà per sempre. Se sap una miqueta de quins possibles successors pot tenir, quines orientacions hi poden haver.
Right, well, 2 questions there. First of all, who can follow Putin? Well, there are several around him, of Khrushchev and Einstein, of SDR and so forth. But will things change? You know, people have been talking, Zelensky has just been predicting, saying that Putin is about to die. Where he gets this information from, nobody knows. But I think that we are not going to see a tremendous change at the moment. And this is something which Putin has wanted to create himself. He has created such a momentum towards a national crusade, a war, that he doesn't want to have. In fact, this is his legacy, really. If he is about to die, he wants to be remembered as almost the person who started to re-establish the old Russian Empire as it was before. As for the question of population and the threat from Russia, I mean, yes, one can come up with these statistics. I mean, for example, actually, you know, in many ways the Russian economy is not much greater than Italy's. But at the same time, in terms of population, Russia has a much larger population of young males who can be, shall we say, sacrificed, what the American historian Edward Lutzbach referred to as disposable sons. And we've seen this, particularly the Buryats from Central Asia or whatever. Those are the ones who were encouraged to volunteer. And in fact, now the Russian army is increasing very rapidly because they've been offering so much extra money to those who volunteer that lots of young men in Russia, even though there is, shall we say, not much unemployment, are signing up because they think it'd be easy now that the war is nearly over. And so apparently that has actually encouraged this great rush. But what is very striking, of course, is one of the reasons for Putin to invade Ukraine is that he's obsessed about the demographic loss in Russia. The reproduction rate is so low, and hardly surprising in many areas. Why? And especially amongst the way we have seen so many of the bright and intelligent young Russians leaving the country, whether for Finland or for Georgia or the Caucasus, as soon as the war in Ukraine started. But we will see, I think, a continuation of the fighting, because I mean there are still, shall we say, quite large areas of population in Central Asia and others who may well be, you know, dragooned or forced or called up for the forces. They may have used up many of the prisoners from the Gulag, from the those, rather as they were used as cannon fodder, or meat for the cannon, as the Russian phrase goes, and Prigozhin. I will show you later. I've got this wonderful photograph. After Prigozhin was killed, he was turned into a saint by the Orthodox Church, and there you can see these icons of Prigozhin holding the sledgehammer with which they killed deserters. And here you have this sort of being held up by, you know, the archimandrites and metropolitans or whatever of the Orthodox Church. So this sort of integration of church and state and church and army is a very strong one indeed. But anyway, the point is though that he really, one of the real reasons also for having Ukraine back was simply says that would sort of, for him, boost again the Russian population, because under his definition that all Ukrainians were not Ukrainian but Russian. Conquer the country and look what you've got.
And this idea that the demise of the USSR starts at the moment when someone thinks that there are Soviet republics, right?
Yes.
I mean, the time we started saying that Ukraine is a Soviet republic, that Georgia is another one, and so on. This is the beginning of the disintegration of the great empire that Russia is entitled to, and will always be entitled to.
But do you remember that very bizarre thing, just before the invasion of Ukraine, when Putin started saying that it was Lenin's fault, it was Lenin's fault that somehow that Ukraine had independence. Actually, Lenin had nothing to do with that. Lenin's mistake, actually, funny enough, was with Finland. And it was the Finns who managed to achieve real independence at that particular stage. Lenin's attitude was, let's pretend that they've got independence, you know, because he said we as Russians do not want to be seen as sort of chauvinist Russians. What we want to do, basically, is give them the idea that they're developing their own particular form of communism, but as long as it comes back under us, then we can pull them back under control. So it was just purely a temporary thing, but it gave the Finns the opportunity to escape the Soviet prison at that particular point. But not Ukrainians. So Putin got that one entirely wrong.
Més preguntes. Una altra aquí.
Jo també la faré en català.
Oh, right, can I hang on? Yeah.
S'ha dit que des de 1945 no ha hagut una guerra entre grans potències per la por a les armes nuclears. Un conflicte nuclear feia impensable una gran guerra. Ara que es torna a parlar tant de guerra entre Rússia i Europa i s'intervé o intervé als Estats Units, s'ha perdut aquesta por a les armes nuclears?
Yes, a very important point about the nuclear weapons and nuclear threat. Yes, I mean, you know, many of us grew up under the idea that sort of someday the world could end with nuclear and in nuclear exchange. And certainly during that period of the intense Cold War, particularly in the sort of 1960s, 1970s, I mean, there were one or two potential accidents which we know about where, you know, we could have actually had a nuclear exchange of some particular form. What has happened though since is that we in the West has always had the attitude that it was always the very last line of defense, that it would only be used if, for example, I remember as a young officer in Germany in 1960s or whatever, we were there purely to slow the Russians down if they invaded, but basically if we had to keep on pulling back and all the rest of it, then the nuclear weapons would be used. But in fact, we only discovered it was a result of one particular spy trial. It was Penkovsky who managed to get the information out via Greville Wynne back in the, I think it was the end of 1959, 1960, I can't remember the exact date, that actually the Russian army, the Soviet army, did not necessarily have the same attitude, that they felt they could use tactical nuclear weapons or battlefield nuclear weapons, i.e. at a much lower threshold. And they still believe that. And this is where one has to be very, very careful. Now, fortunately, the West's command system is sophisticated enough to know that this will be a threat if they explode a nuclear weapon, but it'll be a small one. But it'll be much more to terrorize or to terrify the populations of Western Europe into begging their governments to do what Russia might do. So it could be used, it could well be used as a threat at some particular point. But the trouble was, I think that during the war in Ukraine, Biden and others were basically taking this threat too literally. There's no way that China wanted any form of nuclear games played by Putin. Because let's face it, China, if he wants to take back Taiwan, the one thing he doesn't want is the idea that, you know, Taiwan might have a nuclear weapon tucked away somewhere or whatever, and do anything there. So I think that there's a lot of pressure on Putin not to use battlefield or lower level nuclear weapons. And so it's quite a useful thing for them to do, but it's purely, they're basically just sort of rattling the cage. I don't know whether one has a similar phrase, but you know what I mean.
Molt bé. Hi ha alguna pregunta més? Allà? Sí, no he vist alguna més. Havia vist alguna més allà? Però ara no.
Tenim uns 10 minuts més.
10 minuts?
Vull que fem 9 minuts.
Una pregunta i potser que no ha tingut una altra, si algú té l'última que m'ho digui.
In this geopolitical context, what's the role of the Balkans country, or how you see the region?
Sorry, which country?
Balkans.
Oh, the Balkans. Well, the Balkans are in a difficult position because they have mixed loyalties. Obviously, Serbia, Orthodox, and if you like, the cousins, the southern Slavs, whatever you want to say, and ditto, you know, in Bulgaria and all the rest of it. It's ever since the Second World War, there's always been, of course, this sort of grey area of negotiation between East and West over the Balkans. Not because of sort of going back to Bismarck and the idea about sort of, you know, the Balkans aren't worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier, which was his famous phrase. It was much more of a question that the Balkans are so complicated politically and ethnically. You know, I always remember being told that sort of you can only tell the front line between, if you like, the Ottoman Empire and the European Empire was whether people drank water before their coffee or after it. Whether that's true or not, I have no idea, but anyway, I've always been intrigued by that particular idea. But because of the sort of, if you like, political and, as I say, ethnic complications in the Balkans, I think on the whole, it's an area which the sort of certainly the Western defence systems do not rely on in the way that they would say have relied certainly on other areas further north. But I didn't think I can sort of. I'm certainly no Balkan expert at all. And Paul, come on, I'm sure you can contribute something here on that one and get me out of a hole.
No, I'm not an expert either on the region, but truth is that for the Balkans, something that is quite important to understand is what is the shared future of the region, and something that we have been, at least from Europe, discussing for a long time, is that the final destination of the Balkan countries, at least geographically but also politically, should be to be integrated within the European Union and have their path forward in terms of development, of political consolidation of its democratic institutions, of post-war reconciliation, economic and social well-being, and so on and so forth. And the problem is that that dream or that aspiration has been lost from both sides, right? On the one hand, what we see is an increasing number of countries in the Balkans, particularly Serbia, but not only Serbia, that are driving away from the idea of Europe, and the willingness to become the next members of the European Union is diminishing, particularly the leadership of that country, of Serbia, but also increasingly by the young population, because they feel that their aspirations have not been fulfilled. It has been a dream to be achieved in a long time, such a long time that it will never arrive. That is a problem. So the European dream of the Balkan countries is diminishing, and let's be honest too. In the European Union itself, what we have been witnessing is a decreasing desire to integrate those countries, even if we keep saying that their path, their future belongs to Europe. Let me give you an example. North Macedonia, right? North Macedonia has been asked to change the name of the country, has been asked to change the constitution of the country, has been asked to do all sort of protection of minorities and include the protection of those minorities within the constitution. All those were, and there's still open conflict with member states of the European Union. All these demands have been taken on board by North Macedonia. First because of the Greeks, then because of the Bulgarians, and so on and so forth. But these demands have been taken on board, and still the prospects for joining the European Union are far away. So of course, this speaks also of our very little desire to push forward integration, at least for the last few years. Now there is a change, and that's true. Of course, the Ukraine war, the promise to Ukraine to become a member of the European Union, also to Georgia if the government changes at some point, and so on. That has opened or reopened the path also for the integration of some Balkan countries. So there might be movement going on in the next few years. Maybe some have said 2030 as the time when this country is joined. But for the time being, these lessons of the past in terms of the history of integration of Balkan countries to the European Union are here. And I think we need to be very aware of those. I think we're running out of time, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if there's one last question. I have one personal question for you for the end, but is there one contents-related question that you are missing from the audience? No? Then I will ask you this question.
Let me ask the last question. I have been attending these chats. It's been amazing. You have said, Paul, he's one of the greatest historians alive. I'm agreeing with you. Let me ask you.
I said the greatest.
The greatest. Ah, sorry. Okay. I opened the ranking. Okay. Anyway, looking toward the future, what's your opinion, especially regarding this political extremism in combination with the degradation of information, the degradation of culture? Is it normal to be pessimistic?
Yes. As a general philosophy of life, I've always tended to believe in preemptive pessimism because that is not too disappointed afterwards. But I have to say at the moment, I think of one of my great friends, Simon Sharma, a great historian indeed, whose favourite Jewish joke is the pessimist says to his friend, things couldn't get worse, but his friend, the optimist, replies, oh yes, they can. And I fear that we may be into that sort of position here. I mean, I'm always terrified in the morning of looking on the latest news to find what horror we're going to hear about and what chaos is being suddenly decided upon by some sort of decision in Washington made by somebody who is totally ignorant of the world. So, you know, you wonder where you're going. I mean, if your belief is that you need to shatter the whole of the international order that has existed for whatever it is now, since really since 1945, or certainly since 1989, and somehow think that that's going to improve things, then you really are in a pretty frightening scenario, and you can only fear that your nightmares are not all your worst nightmares are going to come true. I mean, let's face it, 3-4 weeks ago, we knew things were going to be bad, but we had no idea how bad they were still going to get in the next few weeks. I've got no idea. I was telling Paul, I've got to go to Washington next week. I'm terrified on, you know, what one's going to find in, you know, a conference and you know, what people are going to be saying and what they've started to believe. Now, the thing is, there are still in the United States, let's face it, only roughly 50% of the population voted for Trump. There are still lots of good people there who are traumatized, literally traumatized by what's happening to their country. And they cannot believe it. And we in Europe, to a certain degree, find it, not only are we dismayed, but I mean, we are looking at a changing world in disbelief, which is changing from day to day. So, you know, to talk about the future in any way at the moment is impossible, because all of these different elements that we've mentioned at one stage or another, whether technological, economic, social, and as I say, moral, all of these are creating knock-on effects in different ways, which we cannot predict. I mean, the only comparison I can make is like to a pinball machine, where you don't know which direction the ball is going to bounce off. So, you know, I mean, a historian is about as useless as you could possibly hope for, because, you know, we study the past. All we can do, perhaps, is to point out some of the mistakes that we should watch out for and try not to repeat. but I don't think we can do any more than that. I mean, I always feel, I get imposter syndrome slightly when invited on news programs, you know, sort of saying, you know, what's going to happen next? History is not a predictive mechanism at all, and it can't be, and one must never pretend it is.
We just ended on the exact note that I wanted to ask you. What are you working on now? What's the next thing that you think should be studied? I mean, I'm also asking because I'm sure there are historians in the room, and they would like to know what would be your advice into what needs to be studied next.
I think we do need to study particularly what I talked about earlier, that this period of 1989 through to sort of 1995, all of the social changes that were starting at that particular time. This was the start of the real start in progressivism and the idea of different sort of, you know, liberal ideas that were going to open up. And of course, what we're facing now, of course, is the crisis of progressivism. We are seeing the counter-revolution of, okay, woke went too far in America in many ways, you know, defund the police and all the rest of it, which was what handed the ammunition and brought Trump to power. But what we've got to understand is, you know, is there a way that things can calm down, or are we going to have to go through a terrifying period, a really black period of hatred, of the belief that might is right, that the strong can oppress the weak, all of these horrors which we're now seeing, which, as I said, we haven't seen since the 1930s, as a sort of justification for the behavior of powerful men. And that's basically, it is always going to be men. I mean, I think this is where we need to understand and why we changed during that particular period, and then up to 2008 when we had the financial crisis across Europe and all the rest of it. And people's fear, which was created then, and which is actually, when people are afraid, they become violent, and when people are afraid and they gain hatred. And the trouble is, of course, a combination of things, and when I say technological, by that I mean social media, the ability then to express their hatred against other human beings rather than against, say, ideas or anything like that. And this is what has become, I think, so very frightening. And that I think is what we need to study in even greater detail.
Thank you very much. So on that note, we'll end and we'll try to follow, of course, your advice. It's been a pleasure, and I've learned so much. So I'd like to thank you first for your session, for agreeing to have this discussion here with me and in Documenta. But let me also thank the audience, but more in particular Documenta itself, because for 50 years it's not something that should go unnoticed. So thank you very much for your sessions, for this great work that you are doing, and congratulations for that. So thank you very much.
Antony,